You're not behind. And I know that sentence feels almost impossible to accept right now, because everything around you seems to suggest the opposite. Things aren't broken, but they're not working either. Nothing clearly went wrong. And still, something stopped fitting. You feel it when you wake up, not as despair, but as a strange, hard-to-name weight. The sense that continuing the same way takes more energy than it used to. As if something inside you were resisting, without you even knowing exactly what. Most people call this being behind. They think they wasted time, that they fell behind while the world moved on. But listen carefully. There's a very specific moment in life when nothing seems to move forward because everything is reorganizing on the inside. And that moment almost never looks like progress. It looks like doubt, like silence, like a mild but constant confusion. If you're watching this right now, it's not because you're lost. It's because you've arrived at the exact point where ignoring what's changing starts to cost more than facing the unknown. And that doesn't happen when we're behind. It happens right before everything begins to align. And the reason this moment feels so uncomfortable, almost no one talks about it. But you're going to understand today. Because what you're feeling right now isn't the end of something. It's the exact point where almost everyone gives up, without realizing what was about to happen. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too much. You put in effort, but that effort doesn't turn into progress. Things still function, but with friction. Nothing collapsed. Nothing went wrong enough to justify escape. And precisely because of that, it's easy to pretend everything is fine. But something starts to weigh on the details. In the way you wake up without the same clarity as before. In how simple tasks require more energy than they should. In the strange feeling of being present and, at the same time, out of place. Plans that once felt right begin to lose their pull. And that would be normal. If you didn't feel, deep down, that insisting on them now is pulling you away from something important. That's where confusion shows up. From the outside, it looks like delay. Like you took too long. Like others moved forward while you stayed behind adjusting small things. And that interpretation is dangerous because it sounds too plausible. It explains quickly. It comforts for a moment. And it avoids the real question. Because when alignment truly begins, it rarely feels like progress. It feels like losing reference points. Old motivations no longer push you forward. New ones don't have names yet. And you don't know exactly which version of you is in charge. This isn't stagnation. It's transition. And real transitions don't come with clear instructions. They come with silence, with hesitation, with the uncomfortable sense that something has already changed, even if nothing on the outside proves it yet. What confuses people most is that it doesn't feel urgent. It doesn't hurt enough to run away. It doesn't clarify enough to move forward. But it's exactly this in-between that makes so many people lose their way. Because it's not a pause. It's reorganization. And almost every real alignment begins like this. What if the problem isn't that nothing is working, but that the calculation that brought you here no longer applies? That feeling of being out of rhythm isn't confusion. It's a signal. It's the old calculation stopping working. When insisting starts to cost more than letting go, something has already changed, even if the world hasn't caught up yet. And here's where almost everyone gets it wrong. They expect alignment to come with clarity, with energy, with that comfortable certainty that everything finally makes sense. But real alignment begins in the opposite way. It begins when the old way stops responding, when continuing requires too much adjustment, when maintaining what works starts demanding presence, truth, coherence. And that's unsettling. Because on the outside, life still looks manageable. Nothing collapsed. Nothing exploded. But on the inside, something has already shifted. The moment before things click rarely feels like progress. It feels like losing traction. It's exactly in this interval that many people turn back, thinking they're being prudent. They return to what's recognizable, to what they know how to do well, to what doesn't require internal reorganization. And they don't realize that the real cost isn't in moving forward, but in interpreting this moment the wrong way. If you're here right now, feeling this strange mix of fatigue and anticipation, of contained tension and inner silence, this isn't delay. It's active transition. And from here on, what matters most isn't moving fast. It's not trying to fit back into a calculation that has already stopped working. The problem starts when you try to ignore this. Because real turning points don't arrive with clarity. They don't come with extra energy. They don't show up as well-formed decisions. They begin on ordinary days. You still wake up at the same time. You still reply to messages. You still do what's expected. You still look functional on the outside. But something internal stops sustaining itself as easily. This isn't collapse. It's efficiency. The system starts withdrawing energy from structures that have already fulfilled their role. That's why the exhaustion doesn't come from too much effort. It comes from effort that no longer returns meaning. You're not tired of trying. You're tired of maintaining coherence with something that no longer keeps pace with who you're becoming. And this kind of change doesn't ask for an announcement. It doesn't ask for an immediate rupture. It simply installs itself. Quiet. Constant. Hard to unsee. And that's where many people make a mistake. They try to internally justify what has already started to weigh on them. They try to normalize it. They try to push a little longer. But when this weight appears, it's not a request for external adjustment. It's an internal warning. And the more you try to continue as if nothing were happening, the more expensive it becomes. Not on the outside. On the inside. Here's the point almost everyone misinterprets. You're not waiting for alignment. You're inside it. The instability you're feeling isn't the before of change. It is the change happening before it becomes visible. Alignment doesn't begin when everything makes sense. It begins when the old way stops responding. That's why there's no clarity. That's why there isn't constant excitement. Because what's reorganizing isn't your plans. It's the way you respond to life. And here's the detail almost no one accepts. Trying to wait for this to pass doesn't work. Because this isn't a neutral phase. It's an active transition. And active transitions don't allow a comfortable return. Either you listen to what's changing, or you spend energy trying to silence it. That's why so many people call alignment chaos. Because it doesn't arrive to organize. It arrives to replace. When this discomfort appears, the mind switches into emergency mode. It doesn't ask what's changing. It asks, how do I make this stop? And almost everyone responds the same way. They try to over-understand, over-plan, wait for certainty before acting. Not for clarity, but for relief. The problem is that control doesn't bring relief at this stage. It brings delay. Because the control you're trying to use now is the same one that worked before the change began. It's old software trying to run a new reality. That's why nothing fits. You revisit past decisions. You consider returning to familiar versions of yourself. You look at paths you already know won't expand you. Not because you want to follow them, but because they're predictable. And predictability feels like safety when everything is reorganizing. But here's the critical point. Alignment doesn't respond to attempts at guarantee. It responds to coherence. The more you try to force certainty, the more disconnected you become from the real movement. Not because you're doing it wrong, but because you're trying to lead something that only moves forward when you listen. And that's why so many people get stuck here. Not because they lack ability, but because they confuse control with maturity. After this point, something shifts quietly. You no longer wake up trying to fix your life. You wake up observing how you respond to it. Less urgency to explain. Less impulse to convince. More attention to what expands and what contracts. Decisions become simpler, not because they're easy, but because the body responds before the mind needs to justify. You begin to notice something subtle. When something is coherent, it doesn't demand continuous effort. It demands presence. That's why certain conversations start to feel draining. Certain environments feel too loud. Certain paths, which once seemed logical, now feel narrow. This isn't rejection. It's adjustment. You no longer need to push yourself or motivate yourself all the time. What isn't aligned requires argument. What is requires only response. And this is the strangest change of all. You don't feel more confident. You feel less divided, less fragmented between what you do and what you know. This coherence doesn't draw attention, but it holds. And when it appears, the world begins to respond differently. Alignment doesn't make life move forward. It makes what isn't true stop. And almost no one talks about this part. Because when something stops, it doesn't look like progress. It looks like loss. Like delay. Like confusion. But what's really happening is quieter than that. You're not being pulled forward. You're being prevented from continuing to lie to yourself. Lying about what still sustains you. About what you call normal. About what has already died, but you keep carrying out of habit. And here's the part that changes everything. If you try to move forward without letting this stop, alignment doesn't disappear. It becomes heavy. Heavy in your choices. Heavy in your relationships. Heavy in every small decision you know isn't honest. Because alignment isn't impulse. It's coherence. And coherence demands its due. So don't try to speed anything up right now. Don't try to turn this into motivation. Or into an answer. This moment doesn't ask for movement. It asks for honesty. Honesty about what you can no longer do without feeling diminished. About what you can no longer accept without tightening inside. You haven't lost your rhythm. You simply can't keep running in the wrong direction without feeling the cost. And that isn't weakness. It's perception. There's nothing to prove here. Nothing to fix in a hurry. Nothing to announce. There's only something simple that you already know. Some versions of you no longer walk with you. And insisting on them requires more energy than letting them go. You didn't arrive late. You didn't miss the moment. You arrived at the point where staying the same starts to be harder than changing. And that point doesn't appear twice. If this found you now, it's not because everything is ready. It's because something has already begun. You can close this video and go on with your day as usual. But what has changed doesn't return to its previous state. Not because it's urgent, but because it's true. And the question isn't whether this will align. The question is, how much longer will you try to live as if nothing were asking to pass through?